Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's live webinar. In today's webinar, we are going to build out a pretty cool feature, which is we're going to see how we can override the default cursor in React and how we're going to be able to learn about working with hooks and with creating event listeners in JavaScript. And the case study that we're going to be using for this and the project we're going to be building out is we are going to see how we can build an image slider. And with the default behavior with most image sliders, as you know, is having some spots on the slider where you can navigate from left to right, which works great. But I wanted to show you how we can actually create a custom cursor, override the browser's cursor. And as you can see right here, I have the finished version. As you can see, when I hover over the slider, it's actually removing the native cursor and it is using a custom one that I built. And right here, it points from left to right, or it's pointing left. And if I click on this, it navigates left. And as soon as I cross the halfway mark, it actually changes the icon to point right. And if I click here, it navigates to the right. So this is pretty neat. And then also, when I remove the cursor, so when I pull it off of the slider and I'm using the rest of the site, then it reverts back to the browser's native cursor. So you're going to learn how to do all of that today in this guide. So let's go ahead and let's get started. And also, I have the actual code here, and I will share this in the group chat if this shows me where to do it. There we go. So if you open up the chat window right here, I have the repository, and like usual, because we only have about 45 minutes or so here, and so I'm going to be going pretty fast. We have a lot of ground to cover, so my recommendation isn't to try to follow along with the code project, and you can see that's what we have right here. And so I don't recommend following along line by line. Instead, watch this, learn everything that I'm doing, and then come back later, take this code project, and then you can build it yourself. And so we have the master branch and then the starter branch. We're going to be starting on the starter one, and then we're going to be building on from there. So let's get started. I'm going to switch to Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to stop the server and switch back to the starter branch. And I'll start the server back up. And I'll kind of walk through the stage where we're starting, and we'll talk about everything that we need to do. So we have a basic app setup here. We have our custom cursor slider, which right now has not been built out yet. And then we have a few divs with content. And if you switch back here and hit refresh, you'll see that we have our standard cursor. And this is using for the slider, I'll open up the slider just so you can see what we're using here. We're not actually going to have to do anything with the slider itself, which is pretty neat, but we're using the React responsive carousel. And so all of that has already been built out. But if you are looking to ever have to implement a slider or anything like that, it is a great one. I've used it on a ton of different projects. And so that's what we're going to be starting with. So as you can see here, we have some elements on the slider that allow us to move left and right. There are these little bars right here. So the very first thing that I'm going to do is show you how you can update the CSS to hide the cursor natively from the slider. So let me open up the CSS file here. And because I don't want to spend all of the time on the CSS, I already have this here. I'm simply going to uncomment it out. I will explain what it's doing though. So if you ever need to hide the default cursor in an application, the command for doing that is defining cursor none. And depending on the type of component you're working with, like a component library, then sometimes you have to call important on it. So I'm calling cursor none on the image slider itself, on that entire div element. And then I'm also calling it a few times here for like those control arrows and some things like that. Now, some other things that I'm doing, so before I hit save here, just so you can see the default behavior, if I come here on the slider and I click, so right now I'm clicking on the slider about 25% of the way here on the left-hand side, nothing happens. And so one of the things we need to be able to do is to expand the clickable area. And there's a few ways of doing that. And so when I was kind of figuring out how I wanted to do this, I started with opening up the dev tools in the inspector here. And you can see those names, those class names. So I saw what those look like. And so I have this control arrow here, and I can just create an override. So in this case, I can say I want to do like 50% of the view width, and see how that changed. And now if I click here, now this is clickable. And so usually when I do these sliders, I do them full screen. So this is going to be a little bit different, but it's fine for this use case. Just know I'm going for essentially 50% of that div element. And so now you can see that side's clickable all the way here on the left-hand side. 50% of, or I should say 50% of the viewable area, VW stands for the view width. It's actually more and it's bigger than 50% of this, but you can adjust that on kind of a case-by-case basis. So on the CSS here, I'm changing the slider arrows to be that 50%, and then I'm removing the cursor. I'm also removing the background. I'm not sure if you can really see it, but when you hover over, it kind of darkens that, and I wanted to remove that. And so I unset that. And then I add a few more calls to cursor none. And then I'm also doing a display none for the arrows themselves. So now if I hit save and come back here, watch what happens. When I hover over, the cursor actually disappears. And so it's still clickable if I come in here, and it's clickable on the left and right hand side, but the cursor itself has disappeared, which is exactly what we're looking to do. So essentially what we need to do to get this working, let's write some comments here, kind of pseudocode for what we're looking to do. We don't have to make any more changes on the CSS side of things. But what we need to do here is we need to create a component, and that will function as the cursor. So that's going to be kind of the very first thing that we do, is we're going to create a component. Instead of using the native one, we're going to create essentially a div, and then we're going to have that div function as the cursor. So that's the first part of it. But after that, we need to actually control the position of the div dynamically. So it's not enough to just create that div, because the div has to know where the mouse is or where the cursor position is on the page in order to know where to place the div. So that's going to be one of the other things we do. Then we're going to create some hooks that will give the position of cursor, and we also need to know the image position as well. Because if you remember back to when I showed you what the final version looked like, the mouse or the cursor, we need it to only show up when it's hovering over. So how do we do that? Well, CSS has some hover rules that we could use, but in this case, those wouldn't be really helpful for us. So what we need to do instead is we need to actually figure out the exact area on the screen where this div is. We need to know the top, the bottom, and then both sides. So that is what we're going to be creating two hooks that are going to give us that position, the cursor or mouse position, and then also what is technically called the viewport position, or where that div is on the screen itself. Because one other thing that you may think is, oh, I can just, take the distance from the top and the bottom. That would only work in certain cases, because we need this to work even after the user scrolled. So this, where this div is placed, is going to be on a different spot than from the top. We need to know the exact area, and the exact coordinates of that. And so you're going to see how you can actually tap into the coordinates of any element on the page. And that's really one of the key things I want you to be able to take away after this workshop, is being able to understand how you can really kind of dig in and get to know the rules and the values for anything that you might be using in JavaScript. So we're going to create those hooks. Then we're going to wire them up. So wire up the cursor to the slider and hooks. And then lastly, we're going to call from component. So here, and this is following along pretty much identically to how I would do this if I were to be asked to build this type of feature. I would start off by creating some comments that walk through exactly what I'm planning on doing, and adding some details to help me along. Because one of the most challenging things as a developer, especially when you've been asked to do something you've never done before, is a lot of times that project or that feature might seem really intimidating. One of the best ways to help fix that is by breaking that problem into very small, manageable chunks. And that's exactly what we're doing right here. So let's first create this component. It's not going to do very much. It's simply going to sit there, but we'll at least be able to see it on the page, and then we can take it from there. Also, in the styles, one other thing that I gave is what the cursor is going to look like. So I have a set of CSS rules. They're pretty basic. It's going to be a flex container. The position is going to be fixed. This is something that is very important, which means that we're going to have this. We can essentially, when you're using this fixed position rule, that means we can tell the HTML exactly where this is going to be. Usually when you use fixed, you're doing it for like a nav bar or something like that. In this case, we are going to be using that position value, and we're going to be dynamically changing where it's located based on where the mouse is. And so we'll need the hooks, though, in order to do that. But let's first start off by creating this. So I'm going to say export const, and let's just call this the slider mouse, something like that. It's not going to take any props, and it's simply, for right now, it's just going to return a div with the class name of, I believe I called it slider cursor. And then inside of it, we'll put one of those arrows. We'll just put the left one in there. And then we can call this from within the image slider. So here we're going to call the, what do we call it? The slider mouse. Yeah, there we go. And just hit save, and let's see, make sure that that's on the page. And there it is. So that's what our cursor is going to look like, as you saw when I showed you the finished version. So it's just sitting up there because right now we said it's fixed. So we need to be able to update those position values. So now let's go into this hooks file. And this was, I want to say this was 2 or 3 months ago at one of the workshops, I walked through how to build a use responsive hook. This one showed how to get the window dimensions, and we're going to be using this in not too long as well. And so this is something that I already put in here because we already built it. And also we can use it as an example because the same processes that we used here are going to be pretty similar. In this case, we were working with the window height values. Now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working with the viewport, and we're going to be working with the mouse position. So let's first create the viewport position. So, because that's the trickier one out of the two. So I'm going to say export const, and let's just call this view, use viewport position. It's going to take in a ref, which we've talked about refs before. We'll just use type any for right now because I don't want to get too deep into TypeScript details. And so right here, I'm not sure if anyone's ever heard of the program, but Copilot by GitHub is something I recently installed, and it's pretty cool. Right now, what it's trying to do is it's actually trying to recommend what I need to do in order to get those positions. And so I could just hit tab and it would do it all for us, but that wouldn't really be very fun. We need to actually learn what we're doing as we're typing it out. So that is, though, a pretty cool tool. If you've never heard of it, you can sign up. They're in private beta right now, but you can sign up and get access to it. So I'm going to create a const, a piece of state here, and we're going to be pretty close with what it's recommending at first. So set position, and then inside of here, I'm not going to use their X and Y's. We're going to use that on the mouse. The reason why is because if I used X and Y for the access values here, then it might get kind of confusing because we are going to use those for our mouse event listeners. So inside of here, I'm going to have a top, which is going to be of type number, and actually I'm going to define this as a type first. So say use state, just so TypeScript can know what we're using or what our names are going to be. We're going to have a top number, a bottom number, and then a left number, and then a right number. And then as the default value, we're going to start off with this value just being undefined. So what that is going to tell us is this viewport position hook. We're going to be able to attach this to any div element anywhere on the page. And then from there, it's going to tell us exactly where it's located. The top position, the bottom, left, and right. It's going to give us those coordinate values. So from there, we're going to use the React use effect hook here. And so we're going to use the ref, which is getting passed in, and we're going to walk through how to pass that in here in a little bit. So anytime the ref changes, then we want to update that value. So I'm going to be looking for changes to the ref, and technically because I'm using a listener, we could try this by just essentially instantiating the listeners, and we don't even have to listen to changes, which might help a little bit on the performance side. So let's start off with that. If we need to add it in later, then we can. And so here I'm going to create a function. Let's call this const, and I'll just call it viewport handler. You can call it whatever you want, though. And so inside of this function, we're going to grab onto that ref. So say const viewport position, and I'm going to set this equal to the ref. I'll make sure that these exist. So I'll use optional chaining here. And so I'll say give me the reference, give me the current value of it. And then this isn't specific to React. This is in vanilla JavaScript, bounding client rec. So this is going to give us essentially the bounds of this reference. And then from there, we simply are going to have to say set position. So we're setting our state. And then inside of here, then we'll set those values. So we know we have a top value, which will have viewport position top, and then we'll have a bottom, a left, and then a right. And so those are all of our values for the position. Then from that point, then we're going to have to build out our actual listeners. So to do this, once again, this is in vanilla JavaScript. So we're going to call on the document itself and then add event listener. We're not looking in this case for the scroll event. And instead, I'm going to listen for the mouse move event. We'll pass it in viewport handler, and then we'll pass in an optional value of passive true. Just another thing to kind of help with the performance. And then because if you remember back to any of the other times I talked about the React hooks, especially the use effect hook, anytime you create a listener, you need to make sure that you are essentially ending that listening event. And so whenever you pass a function to use effect, then you're saying, whenever you're done with this, I just want you to throw it away. Because if not, you're going to have a bunch of these event listeners just kind of hanging around in memory in the browser. And that could lead to a very bad experience for the users. So now we're going to call document. Oop, not that document. There you go. Document dot remove event listener. We're going to listen for the mouse move event to end, and then we'll tell it which function to essentially kill. So if you haven't done a lot of work with event listeners before, what we're doing here is we're just saying we want to create something that is listening for changes inside of this document, inside of the page. We want specifically to look for when the mouse is moving. And then whenever that happens, we want this process to run. So in this case, we're saying whenever the mouse is moving, I want to update wherever the values are for any ref that we pass in. And then from that point, this is a function at the end of the day. So we need to return the position. I'm going to say if position, return the position. If not, then return null. And let's place that inside of the else block. And so this way, the only way that something will get returned is if we have actually, if the position has been added, because there will be times where maybe the document hasn't loaded or something like that. And so we only want to return a value there if it exists. And then let's also, inside of here, let's just print this out just so we can see what data we have access to. So let me just print out the viewport position, and then we will be able to see this. So now we can test this out. So inside of our custom slider here, or in the slider mouse, it doesn't really matter. You could call it from anywhere, but I'm going to use it in the custom cursor slider. Then what we can do is actually call this. So I already did the ref that we're going to use. And now we can just call this hook and then listen for those values. So in this case, let's just get the viewport position. So viewport position, and we'll set this equal to use viewport position. And then we need to pass in a reference. So the way the reference works is you instantiate a reference, you call it from right here, and then you have to tell it what div or what element on the page you're wanting to reference. In this case, we want it to be this entire slider. So all of those things we just did for finding out where it starts, where it ends, those kinds of things, they're now all attached right here. So let's now, and we can also print it out here. We're going to get double values, but that's fine. Viewport values. And let's just see what we have access to. Make sure that I typed everything in right too. Okay, so let's open this up, and yes, it is all working. So here are our viewport position values. So if I click on the object, you can see we have the bottom, left, right, and top. And so this is pretty neat. This is giving us the exact set of values that we're going to need to be able to know where this element is on the page. So that is pretty neat, because this is the first part of what we needed to get. We needed to know where this was because we need to know when to turn it on and when to turn it off. That's the first part. Now we need to grab the mouse values, because we need the mouse values, one, to know if we should show our custom cursor or not. And then also because the mouse value is going to dictate exactly where the cursor shows up. So we can get rid of those console log statements because they're going to run every single time that you have this, that anytime the mouse moves. So that's not really ideal because that's going to be a lot of output in the log. So now that we've done that, now let's create our next hook, which is going to be the mouse hook one. So that one's, it's very similar. There's just a few key differences to kind of keep in mind. One, we're not going to be using a ref because we can tie directly into that mouse position. So export const, and then we'll say use mouse position. We're not taking in any refs. Copilot's great, but sometimes it gets a little bit excited and it tries to recommend some things that you don't actually need. So use mouse position. Here we're going to be creating some state once again. So I'm just going to call it mouse position state. And then inside of here, we're going to have just set up some kind of default values. So say X is going to be null. And then, oh, actually, I'll create this type first. So it's going to be of type number, Y will be of type number. And then we'll set these. You can have them set to be 0, or you can have them set to be null. I personally am going to do null because these values are going to be set very quickly. And if you set them to 0, what I've seen happen is you'll see a little mouse flickering on there. But if it's set to null, then you don't even have to show anything at all. So that's why I'm doing that. And then once again, we're going to create a React use effect hook. And in this case, we're going to simply have this load up. Whenever you put empty brackets and you pass that as a second argument to use effect, it means it'll just run one time, which that's all we're needing here because the event listener is going to listen for changes itself. So here we'll create a handler, once again, very similar to how we did with the view handler. So I'm going to call it the mouse move handler. And it's going to take in a function, or it's going to take in an event, I should say. So it's going to take in an event. And so we're going to call this client X number, client Y number. And so inside of there, we can set those values. So the way that JavaScript works is very similar to the way the viewport works. Whenever the mouse moves, you have the ability to kind of reach in and grab whatever value that's at. So if you think of like a graph when you were doing math and you remember the X coordinates or the X line going horizontally and then the vertical axis being Y, that's what we're doing. And by getting those coordinates, we can know exactly on the page where this needs to be positioned. And so now we simply need to call our listener, which in that case, our Copilot helped out nicely. So we're listening for the mouse move event. We're passing it the mouse move handler, passive true once again. And then return, we're going to return the values and we're going to remove that event listener. And then lastly, we're simply going to return the mouse position here. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff, but as you can see, whenever you're needing to build out these event listeners, the pattern is pretty similar. If you remember back to when we did the window listener to get the size of the window, we followed the exact same pattern. We had a function that was called, and then we grabbed the window resize change events, those kinds of things. We're doing the same thing here. We're just now listening for different values. So for use mouse position, now let's go and let's actually add it and see what we have access to. So inside of our slider mouse, we're going to grab the X and the Y values, and we'll call use mouse position. We don't have to pass it in any functions. It should be X and Y. There we go. And now what we can do is we can check to see and set these values. So I can pass in an inline style tag, pass in an object saying I want the left position to be, and I'm using string interpolation here, X pixels. So imagine that the mouse is in the top left-hand side. This is going to be 0, and it's going to be 0 pixels, which means it needs to be positioned in the top left. And then next, we're going to pass in right, string interpolation once again. And inside of here, we're going to say Y pixels. And then I think that is all we need. This isn't going to do the kind of magical changeover event yet. We're going to need the window size in order to know how to do that. But this should at least start moving the mouse around. And let's also console log this out. Mouse position, and let's just, let's do X and Y, and you'll see these values. Okay, let's see if this is working. Okay, so hit refresh, and yep, look at that. It is giving us part of the values. It's not everything yet, but as you can see there on the left-hand side, we have the mouse position. When I move it left, and then that's changing. As you can see, it's changing very quickly. When I move it up and down, that's all working. So it does look like I have a little bit of an issue. So I have my left and my right. I wonder if I type something in wrong here, because it's not moving it up and down. It's only moving it left and right. So let's see what I'm doing wrong. Okay, X and then Y, and then we're sending back the mouse position. Okay, looks like that part of it's working. Left and right, X and Y. Okay. Let's see, left should be X pixels, and then Y should be those pixels. Okay, and you know what, let me I'll get the window position as well. So let's grab that just so we can see if that has an issue. Okay, so I'm going to get let's get the window width, and we don't need the height. And we'll grab this from the use responsive hook. There we go. And now what we can do is we need to find where the middle is. So we can define a variable here called middle, and we'll set this equal to window width simply divided by 2. So now we'll say if X is less than the middle, then we want to have the caret left icon. And then when it's to the right, or when X is greater than the middle, then we want to have caret right versus left. So that should at least give us that behavior where it's switching from right. So let's hit refresh and see if that part's working. Yes, it is. As you can see right here, it toggles left and right. So that is working nicely. Now it's still not giving me the up and down though. So we're gonna have to figure out what the cause for that. So it might have been some of the autocomplete doing something, but we'll see. We won't worry about it right now. Let's just keep getting this side of it working. Okay, so we have our slider mouse that's being called. We have our viewport position. So if you notice, one issue we have here is our mouse does disappear when it's hovering over, but then when I go all the way to the left or down, it's still showing up. So that's not what we're wanting. So what we need to do is we now need to connect both the position of the div with the position of the mouse. And so that's what we're going to do in the custom cursor slider here. So inside of the custom cursor slider, let's create some checks. So I need the mouse position. And so let's also call that. So I'm going to say const, and then I have my X and Y, but I'm going to rename these. And so you can do aliasing in React. So I'm going to say I want the X, but I want to call this let's call it the horizontal mouse position, just so it's super clear exactly what we have access to. And then Y will be the vertical mouse position. And so the way it works is now if I want to see where the mouse is in relation to the horizontal line, then we can call horizontal mouse position. And let's do that here. So horizontal, and then we'll call horizontal mouse position and vertical, and we'll see what we get access to with that vertical mouse position. Okay, let's see what that is. And I believe, yeah, I removed that console log, so we won't be getting those annoying ones. Okay, so now as you hover over, you can see that those values are changing. So if I move up and down, you'll see that vertical value is changing. If I move left or right, the horizontal values are changing. So now what we need to do is to do a check and say that this slider mouse should only show up if it is within the bounds of that div. So how do we do that? Well, we can just create a variable to keep track of it. So I can say const, and we'll say mouse is hovering. And then I'm going to set this equal to a long ternary statement. So I'm going to say vertical mouse position. If it is greater than or equal to the viewport position top, and make sure that it exists first. So if it's greater than or equal to the viewport position top, and then it's going to keep on trying to give me some advice. If the vertical mouse position is less than the viewport position bottom, yes, that is correct. And if the horizontal mouse position is greater than the viewport position left and then right, then if all of those things are true, then we want to show that. So let's see if that part of it's working. So if mouse is hovering, then we're going to check and we're going to then show it, or we're going to hide it. Now, this by itself, we could technically just do this where I could say mouse is hovering and double ampersand here. If it's hovering, show the slider mouse. We might have to add in another kind of a more stringent set of conditionals for some edge cases, but we can at least test this out to see if it's working. So, okay, so notice here, the cursor no longer is showing up. Okay, that's good. And if I hover, then it appears. Still not in the perfect position yet, but we'll take a look at that at the end. So that part of it's working. If I have my mouse anywhere around the area, it's not showing up. As soon as I hover over, then it does. And it is switching from left and from right. So that part of it is all working. Perfect. So this is all good. A few things just to keep in mind, some other kind of things that I might do is I might create a function here that says something like show slide mouse. And then I could put some other conditionals. So for example, you don't always know if this viewport position is going to be there or not. And so if the viewport isn't there, which means like it's by default, it's not going to be there because it's not there until the document loads and then the mouse moves. So if that's not there, then you might just want to return true. So by default, say you are using a giant image slider that takes up the entire page, by default, you might want that to be true. And then besides for that, then you would just say if mouse is hovering, then you can, any other condition, you could just say mouse is hovering, true or false. And then you could call this function here. And then you're going to get a very similar behavior, but this also gives you the ability to kind of capture some edge cases. And so as you can see, that is still working. Okay, and we still have a few minutes, so let's see if we can figure out why it is only showing up at the top. My guess is that there is something with the bounds of the height of it. So let's check that out though. So left and right. So we are getting the correct left and right positions. And oh, you know what? I need to put in the let me say I should need to put in the top and bottom, I believe. So that's probably the issue. Let's see. So we can do left. Yeah, let's just do that. We don't even need the right. We can just say top Y here, and that should do it for us. Okay. And there we go. And now it's working beautifully. And as you can see, I can click around here and it functions exactly like the regular cursor would. This is completely, it functions, even though the default one's hidden, it still functions exactly like a regular cursor. Now we're just using something different to represent that. And so that is really it. You now know how to dig into how React hooks work, how you can use hooks to be able to dig into the events that are happening on the page and to be able to use the knowledge that the document has about events like mouse events, like the window size, and another very popular one that I use quite a bit is the scroll event. So on the scroll event, say that you wanted to do something like this nav bar. This is what you wanted to have at the top of the page. But then when you started scrolling and you got to, maybe 50 pixels down or 100 pixels down, you wanted it to switch into a small nav bar that's stuck at the top. That's what you would use a scroll event for. So if you haven't done a lot of work with the React or JavaScript types of event listeners, some of the really cool behavior that you see when you go to other applications, a lot of them are based around using those listeners because they give you the ability, as you've seen, to have a lot of control and knowledge on everything on the page.